All right, we are in Parashat Vayera, in which Abraham Abinu last week has entered into covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God, and he and his household are now in this covenant. And what we open with this week is Abraham recuperating from his surgery, and God is speaking to him. And in this development, as God is speaking to him, there are these visitors that come to see him, and he feeds these visitors very, very diligently. And he is told that he's going to have a child. And this is amazing news. And, Sarah, considers it to be a bit laughable that she's going to be having a child at such an old age. But the story develops after this entire episode runs. And what I'd like to look at is the following episode, in which God is still speaking to Abraham, meaning the way that the Torah puts it is that Abraham is still standing before God. And there is an interesting dialogue that happens. It's almost as though God turns to the audience, to the reader, and in a soliloquy talks about Abraham and his relationship with Abraham post-Brit, post-covenant. And I want to read to you what it is that it says. This is in Perek Yud Het, Pasuk Yud Zayin. It says, Vadonai Amar, and God said, Hamchaseh ani me Avraham asher ani oseh? Am I concealing from Abraham what it is that I'm doing? Which is an interesting question, because basically what it is that that's saying is, I am now partners with Abraham. I have this covenant with him. And if my covenant is manifest with him, how am I concealing from him what it is that I am about to do? Now, what it is that God is about to do is to deal with the city of Sodom, right? That whole story of the city of Sodom and the destruction of Sodom and Lot being in that city, all of that is on God's agenda. And as he gets to it on his agenda, he turns to the audience and says, Hamchaseh ani me Avraham asher ani oseh? I mean, I've never had to work in the world with a partner before, but now he's my partner, and I have to remember to tell him that these are the things that I'm doing. So God turns to the audience and says, I can't conceal from Abraham what I'm doing. I have to bring him into this project. I have to be able to say to him what it is that we're doing and actually converse with him in it. And it says here, he gives a reason, right? He says, Ki yadativ. I mean, I know this man. And the word dat in the Torah is not just, I know this man. The word dat means I'm connected to this person. I have a relationship with this person. That's what the word dat essentially means. So he goes, I know him. Leman asher yitzaveh et banav et beto harav. He's going to command his children and his household after him, v'shameru derech Adonai. And they're going to keep the path of God. Right? Now, this is God speaking, saying, Abraham is my man on the ground. He's my man in the field. He is the man in my creation project that is going to facilitate my entire vision for this creation. He's my partner in creation. He's going to command his children, his household after him, to walk my path, to walk the path of God. What does that mean, the Derech Hashem? I mean, it means the path of ultimate viability for the world, of ultimate life, not just in surviving, but thriving in the way that God determines it needs to be so that the world thrives. And that Derech Hashem becomes the path of the Jewish people, right? As we are indeed the Banim and Bait of Avraham Avinu, we're the children in the household of Abraham. So God says, look, this is my man. This is my partner. And I know that he's going to command them to walk my path. He's going to command them to do tzedakah mishpat, says the Pasuk, that he's going to teach them righteousness and he's going to teach them justice. They're going to make right what is wrong. They're going to judge what needs to be judged in order to be able to adjudicate justice and establish law and what is right in the world. And all of this, Leman havi al Abraham et asher Leman havi Adonai al Abraham et asher diber alav. All of this is what? So God can give to Abraham what he said he would give to Abraham. And so that's very, very telling, because it says that the whole thing here, the whole aim, is that God can establish his providence with Abraham. Providence, of course, comes from the same as root as provide, right? To provide Abraham God's favor, God's grace, his presence in Abraham's life with all of the good that comes with, right? So that's really important, because what it is saying, essentially, is this whole endeavor is in order for God to be able to have relationship with the world. And in order for God to have relationship in the world needs to be open to have relationship with God and to care. And Abraham is that man, right? Abraham is the one that has responded to and accepted the nature of the relationship. He's accepted the fact that his life, his destiny, is to build an intimate connection and love with God, and that this is what he's going to command his children to do. And that's why this line is so important, because essentially what it is that this line says is that through tzedakah and mishpat, through the walking of the derech Hashem, through righteousness, through justice, through walking the path that is the path of God, defined by God, essentially later in the Torah, it's through that one opens the opportunity, one facilitates, one opens the space and the capacity to engage in relationship with God. And Abraham's going to do that in order that God should, what's the ultimate goal? So he can give. So he can give, so he can nourish, so he can provide, so he can allow to thrive, so he can bless. That's the aim. That's what God's interest is. Now, just to read those two psukim and to kind of think on that and recognize that these two psukim, the soliloquy of God to the reader, is essentially turning to the reader to say, I want you to hear this because it's about you, the reader. Because if you are a child of Abraham Abinu and you are part of his household, this matters to you. This is about you. And this is what the whole endeavor is about. These two psukim essentially can set the entire thing forward. And what that essentially means is that the children of Abraham Abinu, the household of Abraham Abinu, which is, it becomes Yisrael, the whole endeavor is the providence of God and to have the relationship and back and forth with God. And that is what we call in our modern terms, or our vernacular in rabbinic literature, hashgaha, right? The attention of God. The attention of God. The care of God. And vice versa. The care and attention of us as his people. Now, fascinatingly, juxtaposed to those two pisukim is another thing that God says. And it says, Vayomer Adonai. And God said, Za'akat Sodom va'amora kiraba. The alarms that I am getting from the Sodom quadrant, right, from the Sodom sector, are huge, right? They're overwhelming, God says. I'm getting tremendous alarms from what's going on in Sodom. V'hatatam ki chaveda me'od. Their missteps, their transgressions are weighty, very heavy. So that's the indications, right? In other words, the alarms, the information that is coming, the intelligence, so to speak, right, that's coming to God from the Sodom sector is overwhelming, right? It is red alert, because when we talk about tzedakah and mishpat and the derech Hashem, the viability and growth and thriving of society, humanity, ultimately those that walk with God, Sodom is the opposite of that, right? Sodom is not doing tzedakah mishpat. Sodom is not walking the derech Hashem, and it is in danger of falling apart as a result of being void of God's hashgaha, right? Of God's powering and providing, again, providence, of God's providence for it to be able to run and continue. So what does that incur? That incurs a judgment, right? So God is essentially saying at this point, in the next pasuk, Irdana ve'er'eh. I'm going to go down, quote unquote, right? I'm going to go down and see. Now, of course, God doesn't have to go down anywhere because he isn't up there anywhere either, right? Even though we use that again, also in the way that we talk. But when it's again, all in human terms being spoken, right? So God says, I'm going to go down, quote unquote, and see. Haksakata aba elai asu. I'm going to now judge what I am getting intelligence about, right? So the intelligence that I'm getting is that Sodom is no longer viable. It's no longer viable because they are basically walking a completely alien path to the Derech Hashem, to the way of God. They are completely void of tzedakah and mishpat, the things that allow for God to give, to provide, to have providence. And so he says, I'm going to judge whether indeed this needs to be the verdict. In other words, should the verdict be, we're shutting the Sodom project down? That's the discussion. And that's the way that it's presented. Now, remember, the opening line here was, Ham chaseh ani me'Avram asher ani oseh. Right, God's like, am I keeping from Abraham? What is it I'm doing? And this is the question of whether to keep this. Right? It's not even a question of whether to keep it. The question is, what must I not keep from Abraham? I can't keep from Abraham that we've got serious problems with the Sodom sector and that we're going to have to close down the Sodom sector. And it used to be that I did this on my own, but I have a partner now. And my partner is Abraham. And I need to mention this to Abraham because Abraham is the one that has my providence. And Abraham is the one that will allow my true providence to manifest in all of its glory in this world. So God says, I'm going to go down and see, right? Which is, again, those are all terms for I'm going to judge it now. And I want to pause here and recognize something, because some of the Mefarshim insisted, right? Some of the commentaries here insisted that when God says, I'm going to go down and see, that can't mean that God was going to go and find something out that he didn't already know. And so it can't mean that God was going to go down and look at something that he didn't already know. Now, of course, that's true. But the missing bit in those pirushim, l'aniyut da'ati, right, to the poor nature of my own understanding, is that we're not talking here about God's knowledge. The intelligence is already there, right? God knows, of course, what's going on in Sodom. It says, Hatatam ki chaveda me'od. Their het is extremely great. It's very heavy. So it says that explicitly. God knows that. What we're speaking about over here is what is God going to do about that? And what God is going to do about that is preceded by a judgment of the situation, an evaluation, an assessment of the situation. An assessment of the situation gives meaning to the situation, right? It's not just, there's a very big difference between knowing that something is happening and then determining what the meaning of that is and what the resulting action will be from God. Those are two things, two different things. One is the knowledge of God. The other is the care and attention of God. And they are not synonymous, at least not in terms of how it is that we experience them and how it is that they manifest with us, or how it is that the Torah teaches us to relate to it, right? So, for example, one example of God's care and assessment and attention is Rosh Hashanah, right? We look at Rosh Hashanah as the day of judgment, right? It's a day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at the entire world and assesses the entire world. As it says, Mi lo nifkad kayom hazeh, right? Who isn't taken account of on this day? What that means is that it's not that God didn't know what we were doing until Rosh Hashanah. And if God is always knowing what we were doing, and the knowing is synonymous with the judging, well then who needs Rosh Hashanah? Right? God of course knows what's going on. The question is, what are we going to do about what's going on? What meaning are we going to give to what is going on? That is divine judgment. And divine judgment is not ubiquitous. It is not automatic. It doesn't just happen all the time. Divine judgment happens at various points, right? At different times. And one of the things that incurs divine judgment is alarms that come from the project of creation. And when there are alarms that come from the project of creation, it could incur judgment. And that's precisely what's going on over here. Because Rabbah, right? It is overwhelming. And so I'm going to have to assess it, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And if I see that indeed it is as the intelligence is saying, kala, well then it requires wiping them out. It requires obliteration, remember? Requires obliteration. Vimlo, and if it isn't, if I determine in my judgment that it isn't yet at the threshold, that I find it to still have room to have its meaning to carry on, right? In other words, that the definition I will give it is that it still has room to continue. Eda. Well, then I will pay attention. I will give my attention to it. And it will carry on. So this is what God is kind of presenting here in this soliloquy. Right? So one is a soliloquy and one is kind of God talking to himself. Right? Saying, well, we got to go down and see what's happening. Right? At least that's the way that is presented in the Torah. Now it's very interesting because I just want to look here at this particular pasukin where it says ki yadativ, right? And where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to go down and see. Right? So the Ibn Ezra, first of all, looks at this and says, what that means is, I'll read it for you. I'll pull it up here. Where is it? Yes. Then Ibn Ezra says, "Haksa'kata haba I want to see if the alarms that are coming to me are like it down there. I know when I assessment. Im ken asu ba'im kala. Very strange language, right? Because he's saying, if I find that is what it is that they're doing, right? Again, it sounds like a knowledge problem. It's not a knowledge problem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what they're doing. He's saying, I'm going to look and see what the ramifications of what they're doing. Which is simply, the ramifications will be a result of my attention to it. My determination of it. And that's what the Ibn Ezra puts out. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, the Netziv goes even I think that the Netziv goes even further than that. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, in his Perush Ha'emek Davar, he has this beautiful point that he makes. I mean, this is such a powerful point. And you don't even realize he's making it if you're not paying attention. But listen to this. He says, Irdana. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to go down and see. What is that? What is I'm going to go down? So he says, Kvarnit Ba'ar, we said already in the Dora Palaga, because it's not the first time that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says this. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says this by the Migdal Babel, the Tower of Babel. He says, I'm going to go down and see. So he says, what is this going down business, right, of God? I'm going to go down there. He says, Inyan Yirida Kan, the idea of going down, Shehu Hashpalat Kvodo Yitbarach. It is the lowering of God's glory. Lehashgiach b'maaseh b'nei adam shel tohu. To pay attention to and give providence to human beings that are of nothing. Right? They're dust of the earth. V'harehem kektanim she'en kavod la'av lizdakek lishpot ma'asav. They're like little children that it isn't worthy of the honor of the father to be paying attention to these minute details. So essentially what the Netziv is saying is that the default is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in his own glory and of his own honor, isn't paying attention to these small little things. And that's why the story is told this way. I'm getting intelligence coming to me. There are alarms coming to me from that sector. What do you mean there's alarms coming to you? Aren't you paying attention? Aren't you intimately involved with No. And that exposes a huge concept in Torah with regards to theology. Is God constantly, personally involved in everything that is going on in the world? Now remember, that's a very different question than asking, does God know everything that's going on? God knows everything that's going on in the world, and everywhere else for that matter. The question of his involvement in those things is a different question. That question is a question of care. That question is a question of attention, focus. And that is not ubiquitous. The default is that no, God isn't paying direct, micro attention to these things. What happens with Sodom is that it is bad enough that it calls his attention because it might need to be shut down. And that's what the Netziv is saying. And of course, the Netziv is saying that based on the Mesorah of how we understand this theology in Judaism, which Harambam writes extensively about in the Moreh Nebuchim. That it is absolutely the case that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not directly mashgiach on every little thing. If that were the case, then what would be the meaning of a relationship that is built like the one of Abraham Avinu? Oh, the one of Abraham Avinu, which we can begin to understand is beautifully juxtaposed at this stage. Because after the Berit, which is the ending of Lech Lecha, and Abraham Avinu was talking to God at the very beginning of Parashat Vayera, he turns to the camera, he turns to the audience and says, he's my person. He is my mate. He's my partner, my companion in this world. How can I not say to him what it is that we're doing with regards to the Sodom sector? But the very fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking about Abraham that way is because he does have that hashgacha. He does have that providence. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving his attention and concern to Abraham Avinu always. And to juxtapose that, to contrast that with the fact that Sodom has none of that, and the only reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is paying any attention to it is because of the alarms of disaster that are happening to it, and that it needs to be destroyed. But it cannot be destroyed until my partner Abraham, first of all, knows about it and is given an opportunity to comment on it. And that is indeed what happens. Because as it says, right, in the Pasuk, Abraham odenu omed lifnei Adonai. Abraham's still there with audience, right? In audience with God. And Abraham is told about what happens with Sodom. Vayigash Abraham vayomar. So Abraham proposes something to God. He brings something forward to God. Ha'afti spit tzadikim rasha. Well, he asks a theological question. He says, well, I want to understand the nature of the providence that you have, God. Do you just wipe tzaddikim out with Rashayim? And so on and so forth. The whole dialogue goes through, right? We're not going to go through the whole dialogue in this treatment, but the setup for the dialogue, the whole frame of the dialogue. And this is such an important concept in Torah that so often people get wrong. And what they get wrong is that they believe that God, by default, is personally and intimately attentive and caring about every minuscule detail of life, and the world for that matter. And I know this is going to be very hard to hear, but as far as Torah is concerned, it isn't true. It is true that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, knows every detail of the world in your life. The question is, what does he do about it? The answer is, it depends on you. Now, it is true that the Brit of Avraham and those that are living as Avraham and doing tzedakah umishpat and walking the derech Hashem, well, I mean, yeah, they've got the attention of God and the care of God if it is done faithfully and properly. And yes, to a certain degree, even the people that are just born of Avraham Avinu, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, well, there's a certain attention and care that they have simply because of that. But there is a tremendous amount of room to enhance that attention and care with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is, Asher yitzaved banav et beto aharav lishmor derech Hashem. It's the people that are fulfilling the command of Abraham Avinu to walk on the way of God, to do tzedakah mishpat, to live in relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way that is viable and real, not figments of our imagination or the outcomes or offshoots of our emotions or the result of our initial thoughts, but the study and careful investment with what is real and how it is that we can ultimately find enhanced and robust connection with God. And that is the legacy of Abraham Avinu. And that is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu turns to the reader to say in this week's Parasha. Of course, it makes sense when we think about it. What would a relationship be if it was already given at the onset in its fullest capacity? And there would be no room for us to do anything. There would be no room to grow. There would be no development. But of course, there is room. And that room means that when it isn't filled, it is somewhat of a vacuum. It is a random and non-specifically focused place. It is a place that is not running fully and strongly with divine providence. And that is possible in God's world, because when it does happen, it is deeply meaningful. And it is only because there is a void, there's only because that it might not happen, that when it does happen, it means the world. And that is something that we learn from Parashat Vayera. And with that, I bid you all a Shabbat Shalom, and I will see you next week with Parashat Hayya Sarah. And I do encourage you to like and subscribe if you appreciate the Divrei Torah and you'd like to see them get to others. Kol Tov.